trading at a record. Apple now surging by 6.2%. 10-year yield 4.42% with a 2-year yielding 4.84%. Spot gold up $1 the ounce to $23.11. Little change there. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.5%. $78.11 for a barrel of WTI. Michael Dell, the CEO of Dell Technologies, intends to sell 10 million shares worth $1.3 billion. Dell shares, they are trading a little change right now. We do have Dell up by less than 0.1%. And just in time for the summer political conventions, United says it will be adding nearly 200 flights to the Republican convention next month in Milwaukee, and 118 flights to and from Chicago for the Democratic National Convention in August. Shares of UAL, parent of United, down now by 2%. Recapping, S&P down 9, down 0.2%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts. Here they are, Joe Matthew, Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. We're going to need those flights as we prepare to bring you live coverage from both the DNC and RNC, July and August. We have a lot to experience between now and then. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We've been spending a lot of time on the Hunter Biden verdict, as we promised you that we would. But Kaylee, we also have to turn our attention to this very slowly developing story in Israel. Antony Blinken on his 8th trip now to the Middle East, and of course a wait on what's going to happen with a potential ceasefire that the Biden White House rolled out some time ago now. The UN Security Council voting to endorse the ceasefire deal on the table yesterday, and now reporting that Hamas says that it is accepting that UN Security Council ceasefire resolution. Antony Blinken met with Benjamin Netanyahu to talk about this. Here's what he had to say.
I met with Prime Minister Netanyahu last night, and he reaffirmed his commitment to the proposal. Everyone's vote is in, except for one vote, and that's Hamas. And that's what we wait for.
For more, we turn now to Hadar Susskind. He is Americans for Peace Now president and CEO, as we make sense of what we're hearing from the Secretary of State, from the Israeli Prime Minister, and from Hamas itself. Hadar, it does feel like the messages are running potentially into some conflict here, as Blinken says, yes, Israel is behind this. Netanyahu has reaffirmed this, but Netanyahu and his government also reaffirmed that they want to see Hamas entirely destroyed, and a ceasefire agreement would potentially make that difficult to accomplish. And for Hamas saying that it does support the UN ceasefire resolution, we haven't seen all of the parties come out and say the ceasefire begins. So what is your understanding of what exactly is happening here?
Well, Kaylee, I think what we're seeing is both the Netanyahu government and the Hamas leadership want to be seen by the U.S., by the UN, globally, as saying yes to this. They want to be seen as the party that is moving toward peace. At the same time, while Netanyahu just reaffirmed it and Hamas has now welcomed the UN resolution, neither one has said, okay, let's sit down. Let's start talking. Let's implement the ceasefire. They've both agreed in principle and said, all right, now let's start talking about the details, while at the same time, both telling their domestic audiences nothing has changed. On the Israeli side, Netanyahu and others in his government are still saying they're going to completely destroy Hamas. The war is not over until, again, Hamas is completely eliminated, and other very non-specific goals like that are frankly pretty impossible to measure. And Hamas, quite similarly, has accepted the principle, but is still launching attacks. Obviously, has not released hostages, and is still telling its constituency that its plans haven't changed either.
So bring us to a finer point here, Hadar. We all saw the president roll out a fairly detailed 3-phased plan that seemed to be something everybody had their eyes on here. But your point,
according to an Axios reporter on Twitter citing sources, Hamas has given Qatar and Egypt its official response to Israel's ceasefire proposal.
The sticking points when that happens?
Well, there's really one big one, right? The president's plan that he proposed, which again was presented as an Israeli proposal, not the president's proposal himself, said a 6-week ceasefire during which certain hostages would be released and negotiations would start for a long-term ceasefire, for a cessation of hostilities, actually, not just a ceasefire. And the president said, if after those 6 weeks, everything has not been finalized yet, but negotiations are ongoing, then that the ceasefire would hold. And the real difference, the break point here, is this insistence by Netanyahu that they will not end the war until Hamas is completely eliminated. And Hamas's, of course, insistence that they are not going to disappear. So that's the difference. The 6 weeks can be worked out, even the hostage release and the prisoner exchange, because part of this is, of course, Palestinian prisoners who are held in Israeli prisons being released. All of that could be worked out if the two sides would be willing to sit down and do so. But the whole plan here is to get to an actual end game. It's not just to have this short term and this, prisoner hostage exchange. And that's where the seemingly unbridgeable difference is.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seemed it was unbridgeable even inside the Israeli government, because it was a disagreement over what exactly the end game should be that drove Benny Gantz out of the government, out of the war cabinet. He was unhappy with the prime minister not meeting his demands. What influence do you think that departure ultimately has on how this moves forward, Hadar?
Well, Gantz and his folks leaving still leaves Netanyahu with a 64-seat majority in the 120-seat Knesset. So it doesn't change anything immediately in terms of going to new elections. But it's one more sort of push, one more data point, because ultimately what we're going to need is to get to this agreement is a call for new elections and a new government. There is no way that this government, with not only Netanyahu, but the parties led by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, those two in particular, will absolutely never agree to any kind of agreement. They've been quite clear on that. Now, the opposition parties led by Yair Lapid, Yair Golan, and others have said that should Netanyahu move forward with this agreement, they would support his government from the outside, not as members, to implement the agreement. But that would mean that sort of starts the clock ticking on the process of moving toward new elections. And the thing that is maybe the most interesting thing that came up this week is there's a lot of talk now that Netanyahu himself may be getting to the point where he realized he's played out this line. This government, he's dragged it out in all these different ways. He's done all these different things, and he may be ready to start organizing for new elections sooner rather than later.
Fascinating. How about the war cabinet, so-called, Hadar? Is Benny Gantz replaced by a hardliner, or does the war cabinet begin to fracture?
Well, the only people left in the government are very hardliners. And, Ben-Gvir, who has not had a seat in that war cabinet, has been demanding one. It's one of the things he wants to see happen. Frankly, I don't think it makes a very big difference whether he has that seat or not, because there are now no contrasting voices within the government. So the war cabinet becomes largely irrelevant, frankly, because you did have Gantz and his deputy Eisenkot sitting there with presumably at least some differing views, some moderating views. Now that they're out, the only voices in the government are very hardline. You also really have only one leader in the government with significant military experience, which is Yoav Gallant, the Secretary of Defense. Because again, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, the religious party leaders, none of those people even served their regular, 3 years of military service, much less were they generals and military leaders. So they've really thinned the bench there within the coalition.
Hadar, do you think repeated visits like what we're seeing from the Secretary of State, are actually helpful in all of this? He has been to the Middle East now 8 times since October 7th, and it seems pretty consistently he leaves empty-handed, even though he says things like Netanyahu, when he spoke with him, still reaffirmed his commitments to a ceasefire agreement. Is the U.S. government helping?
Well, they're certainly trying to help, and I think that there are benefits to these visits. Remember, they're not solely for the purpose of meeting with Netanyahu or Israeli leaders. I met with Palestinian leaders, Jordanians, many others as well, and it's part of patching together, the necessary coalition to have the political backing to move this forward. Look, I think the U.S. government can and should do more, and can and should take a stronger position vis-a-vis the Israeli government. But what's sure is that this is not moving forward without that significant push from the Americans. And so having Secretary Blinken there, President Biden has been himself, so many of our other leaders, Burns, Jake Sherman, and others have been there, I think is important in trying to move these conversations forward. The question is, what's going to be the ultimate push, the ultimate declaration that nudges Netanyahu across the line? Because we can talk and talk and talk, and what we've seen now is many months of talking about ceasefires, talking about process, talking about different opportunities and different deals. But at the end, there's a binary decision, right? Yes or no. Is there a ceasefire? And whatever it is, we haven't gotten to that point yet. And I think the next big question or the next big moment out there is, of course, we have Netanyahu scheduled to come here to Washington on July 24th now. And we'll see what the situation is, on that day.
We're going to be calling you for insights, I think. Hadar Susskind, it's great to have you back, Hadar. Americans for Peace Now, President and CEO. A story that we'll keep tabs on here on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's worth mentioning, Kaylee, because we spent so much time, and you actually made tracks to Baltimore when it happened. The Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse, the deadly collapse, and a major milestone in the cleanup here as Baltimore's main shipping channel finally reopens.
Yeah, reopened yesterday, which is pretty remarkable. And it's actually something we had the chance to speak to Maryland Governor Wes Moore about a few weeks ago on May 30th, including the economic ramifications the collapse had for the state of Maryland and when he can confidently say things would get back to normal.
We saw during the month of April where there was a real concern about where unemployment rate for the state of Maryland was going to go for the month of April. And we're proud that because we were able to work with the private sector, work with our partners and all of our port partners, that not only for the month of April has Maryland continued to have amongst the lowest unemployment rates in the entire country, we actually gained thousands of jobs during that same time period and watched labor participation actually increase during the month of April. So I could not be more proud of the response of this state. We've got a long road to go, and I will not stop until we have a new bridge, a new Francis Scott Key Bridge built and overlooking the skyline of Baltimore. But the speed of this recovery really has been a marvel, and it's really been because we've had a coordinated effort in getting it done.
Well, you do have a lot to be proud of, Governor, and the heroic actions of the public safety officials in Baltimore and the state of Maryland, including the divers who have been risking their lives to comb the bottom of the floor of the port. Remarkable stories to tell. But then it becomes a question about money, and we've talked about this before on Bloomberg. In fact, we had a conversation earlier with Republican Congressman Patrick McHenry, chairs the House Financial Services Committee, and we asked him directly about the chances for a supplemental budget to rebuild the bridge passing this Congress. And he talked about offsets that would be needed, other budget cuts, suggesting that we're spending too much. What are you hearing from leaders in the House about that, making that happen to rebuild the bridge?
I've been incredibly encouraged by the amount of bipartisan support that we've received. People from not just the Democratic side of the House, but also people from Chair Womack and Chair Cole from Oklahoma and from Arkansas and Oklahoma, respectively. People who have said, we understand the importance of getting this bridge rebuilt because it's a core artery for the Port of Baltimore, which is indispensable to the American economy. And what we're asking for, the 100% cost share, is not saying, the American people are going to pay for it. I'm very confident that the American people will be made whole. When you look at everything from insurance to potential pending litigation, Lloyd's of London has indicated this is going to be the most expensive maritime tragedy in our nation's history. So the American people will be made whole. The reason our ask for the 100% cost share is essentially bridge financing. It's saying that while we're going through the process of a potential litigation, which we know could take years, we've got to get moving. We've got to get building, because my commitment to the people of my state and the people of this country, frankly, is that we are going to build this thing on time and on budget and effectively, and we're going to get the Port of Baltimore going again because it's important to the largest supply chain of our nation. But we've got to get moving. That's the importance of the bipartisan support for the 100% cost share, and we've been incredibly heartened by the amount of by the encouraging words and supports that we've received from members from both sides of the aisle on this issue.
Maryland Governor Wes Moore talking with us last month about today's development now. This week, at least, the Port of Baltimore's main shipping channel fully reopened. I'm Joe Matthew. Kaylee Lyons, I'll meet you at 5 o'clock on the late edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Also an owner, I should have pointed out, of 3 major sports teams.
That's right.
Right? And you were the first woman, as I understand it, first woman to own 3 major, have a stake in 3 major sports teams. Is that right?
Yes, and we'll say African American.
You were approached by the owner then of the, I guess, the Washington Wizards and the Washington Caps about maybe buying the Washington Mystics, which is the women's basketball team. And what did you say?
Well, first of all, it was Abe Pollin. He did come to me and Susan O'Malley, and they said, Abe Pollin says, look, I want you to be the face of the Washington Mystics. And I said, what do you mean be the face of? He says, I want you to buy this team. His health was failing. And I have to tell you, and a lot of women can understand this, we never get these opportunities. So that was the first thing that struck me, and I was flattered. I was really flattered. I said, well, Abe, what are the financials on this? And he handed them to me. He says, well, they're not making money. But I was still intrigued about team ownership.
The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
They're kind of predicting a soft landing, and you see that in both stock prices, which are kind of high, credit spreads, which are kind of low, markets, which are kind of wide open. That's all good. Doesn't tell you what the future is going to be. But I think there are a lot of inflationary forces in front of us that, may keep it a little bit higher than people expect. My view is whatever the world is pricing in for a soft landing, I think it's probably half that. I think the chance of something going wrong is higher than people think.
Bloomberg. Context changes everything. In a multi-trillion-dollar industry, there's a lot of ground to cover.
Bitcoin ETFs rubbing elbows with the big dogs.
This frenzy has engulfed the entire